Clarifications concerning aspects of Stalin's rule. Recently, a statue of Stalin was unveiled in one of the stations of the Moscow metro. And all too predictably, the useful idiots that are Western mainstream journalists, along with an array of other simpletons in the Western world, leapt at the opportunity to accuse Russia of idolizing bloodthirsty tyrants. In addition to that, the same people said that Stalin murdered tens of millions of his own people. Naturally, no empirically based evidence was cited by those idiots, meaning that what they said did not even amount to a claim, because claims are supported with evidence. Accordingly, their words amounted only to propaganda, and crude propaganda at that. Nevertheless, the response to the unveiling of the statue of Stalin presents me, someone who has a PhD in Russian/Soviet history, to clarify certain aspects pertaining to Stalin and his rule. One must first of all differentiate between Stalin the man and Stalin the leader. Indeed, that approach can be applied to every leader in history. Thus, Stalin was a terrible human being and a great leader. In fact, I contend, as a great many Russians do, that Stalin is the greatest Russian leader in history. He found Russia with a wooden spoon and left it with the atomic bomb. And to anyone who remarks that Stalin was not ethnically Russian, he was of course half Georgian and half Ossetian, I say, and neither was Catherine the Great, who was of German ethnicity. So what is your point? Now, returning to my submission that Stalin was a terrible human being and a great leader. My stance will horrify a lot of Westerners, both the useful idiots, politicians and journalists, and regular simpletons, because they are ignorant and simple-minded people. On account of them being incapable of thinking independently and critically, they are blissfully unaware that life is not black and white. Hence, the study of history is extremely complex. Accordingly, Stalin and Hitler, for example, were not monsters. They were human beings who functioned as human beings. And they were anything but insane. Both men were shaped by their childhoods, what was occurring in their respective societies when they were growing up, and the ideologies which they found. Now, returning again to Stalin, a man can be both great and terrible in one stroke. And whilst I understand that may be, for some, exceedingly difficult to swallow, it is, nonetheless, reality. Let me take Edward I of England, also known as Edward Longshanks. He epitomised the reality that a man can be both great and terrible in one stroke. Because Edward was a great king and a terrible human being. How Edward must be turning in his grave as a result of the catastrophic consequences for England stemming from the reigns of Elizabeth II and the incumbent Charles III. Furthermore, to the useful idiots and regular simpletons in Britain who say to me in relation to Stalin, "What about the labour camps?" my response is, you know all about concentration camps, don't you? After all, you invented them during the Second Anglo-Boer War, when you rounded up Boer women and children and imprisoned them in guarded camps where over 30,000 died agonizing deaths. How brave, noble and tough you were to kill women and children, including babies. Turning again to Stalin, he epitomized what it is to be a Russian leader, namely, devoted to the motherland, who ruled with an iron fist and who was utterly ruthless. Peter the Great was also dictatorial and ruthless. The city in Russia which bears his name, St. Petersburg, literally lies on the bones of those who built it, slaves. As I have said on television and in one of my books, Peter turned Russia into a great power, and Stalin turned Russia into a superpower. It is at this juncture that I will say that Russia is not the West, and there is no reason whatsoever as to why it should be. Russia has evolved over centuries in accordance with its culture, values, and historical experiences. Let me now turn my attention to the question of how many people died under Stalin's rule. Well, first of all, when we say the word died, what exactly do we mean by this in the context of Stalin's reign? Executed? Exposure to the elements and disease, along with brutal living and working conditions in the labour camps? Reckless policies which resulted in famine? Such clarity is required. Accordingly, when we talk about how many people died under Stalin, we are talking about premature deaths brought on by policies and actions which Stalin implemented. With that in mind, let me proceed. If we are talking about those who were executed, I cite a figure of between 600,000 and 1 million. If we are talking about those who died in labour camps, I say approximately 1,500,000. And if we are talking about the policy of collectivization, which was ill thought out and recklessly implemented, and which subsequently led to famine, I cite a figure in the region of 5 million. So, in total, approximately 7,500,000 people died prematurely as a result of policies and actions implemented by Stalin. However, it is extremely difficult, nay, impossible, to arrive at a precise figure. So, to be on the safe side, I think it prudent to say that total premature deaths during Stalin's tenure in power range between 7,500,000 and 10 million. It should also be said that there are plenty of other people who were complicit in the premature deaths under Stalin. After all, it was not a one-man show in the Stalin period. Concerning the famine, which engulfed certain regions of the Soviet Union as a result of the policy of collectivization, parts of Russia, parts of Ukraine, and parts of Kazakhstan, a lie has been spun by Ukrainian nationalists since the early 1930s to the present day that Stalin created a famine to eradicate Ukrainians. This is simply anti-communist and anti-Russian propaganda which has no basis. Firstly, the famine affected other parts of the USSR too, namely Russia and Kazakhstan. Secondly, the most heavily affected parts of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic were regions whose populations overwhelmingly regard themselves as Russian. And thirdly, Stalin and his government needed peasants to work the land, otherwise Bolshevik power would have been in peril. Hence Stalin had no wish to see millions of peasants die. Finally, I will now turn to another aspect of Stalin's rule, specifically the creation in 1934 of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Siberia. Stalin's hatred of the Jewish people is very well documented by primary source evidence. Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, observed that hatred during some of his meetings with Stalin, and on one occasion commented to the Soviet leader that there were many Jews in the Soviet apparatus of power, to which Stalin replied, "I will do something about that." Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, also noted in his diary Stalin's hatred of Jews. Now, in 1927, Stalin emerged as leader of the USSR, which marked the end of the collective leadership which had governed the Soviet Union following Lenin's death in 1924. It should be noted that in 1927, and for a few years after, Stalin's rule was not absolute. When the Soviet leadership devised the idea in 1928 of a Jewish Autonomous Oblast, Stalin's private reasoning was guided by his hatred of Jews. Echoing the reasons for why the Tsars had created the Pale of Settlement in Russia for Russian Jews, Stalin supported the creation of a Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Siberia, so that, eventually, he hoped, all Soviet Jews would be resettled there from European Russia, well away from Moscow, the heart of Soviet power. It should also be noted that Stalin euphemistically referred to Jews as rootless cosmopolitans. However, the reasoning for such an oblast by other members of the Soviet leadership was quite different to Stalin's. Hence, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast did not come to resemble the Pale of Settlement when it was established in 1934. However, towards the end of 1939, Stalin's hold over the Soviet Union was almost absolute, especially after the trials and executions of many of his own perceived rivals and enemies, including numerous Soviet Jews such as Kamenev, Zinoviev, Radek, Sokolnikov, Yagoda, Demenstein, and Fignater. Stalin would have another Russian Jew and his arch-enemy, Trotsky, assassinated in 1940. It was then, and only then, that Stalin began to replicate the Pale of Settlement in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. When the Red Army entered eastern Poland in September of 1939, and the subsequent annexation of the region by the Soviet government, Stalin began deporting the region's Jews to the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. With the Soviet-Finnish War of November 1939 to March 1940, the military reforms in the USSR, and the German invasion of Russia in June of 1941, and the ensuing German-Soviet War of 1941 to 1945, Stalin was entirely focused on preserving the independence and sovereignty and security of Soviet territory. However, by the early 1950s, it is believed that Stalin was preparing to deport to the Jewish Autonomous Oblast what remained of Soviet Jewry in the Western USSR, Jews who had survived German occupation. In his diary, Goebbels recorded that when the Red Army began taking back the Western USSR from the Germans in late 1943, Stalin was pleased to learn that the Germans had decimated the Jewish population of this region. Anyhow, possible plans by Stalin to deport what remained of the USSR's Jewish population to the Jewish Autonomous Oblast never materialized as a result of the Soviet leader's death in March of 1953. It should also be noted that to this day, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast exists and of course exists in the Russian Federation. The aim of this talk is not to endorse Stalin's rule or to exonerate him of the appalling crimes which occurred during his tenure in power. Instead, the aim is to clarify what actually happened during Stalin's reign. At a time when the Western ruling elites, or globalists, are not only attempting to distort and rewrite the history of other countries, but also the history of their own countries, it is imperative that true historians charge out of the trenches and confront this most malignant of practices. Thank you, as always, for listening.